Jeff the Killer. By Twisted Steel Dagger. Chapter 1. On the Run. The brush past his sweat-covered face like a blur in his vision. A burning sensation irradiated in his throat as Jeff ran through the wooded area just outside Manhattan. He had just been busted by the Manhattan Metropolitan Police Department, and had to end his 4-week killing spree in the city. 18 victims brutally murdered by Jeff. 2 Colts and a filly missing in the woods. One of the most busy days in Manhattan history in terms of tragedy. MMPD officers were in hot pursuit, trying to catch their perp before he could escape their jurisdiction. They were however unaware of the fact that Jeff had successfully escaped already. Finally he could take a moment to catch his breath. Jeff's last victim wasn't even his to claim. Jane the Killer had beat him to the punch, and was waiting there for him. MMPD officers broke in the apartment before a fight could go down. Jeff pressed his back against a large oak tree, and slowly slid down, trying to return to his normal breathing pattern. Manhattan was simply too bad a place to go on a spree that large. Too good a police department, and with Jane there it would have been time to fight or flee anyhow. You may not be able to tell, but Jeff seriously does not want to smile at the moment. I cannot do that again. Oh dear Celestia, my chest. He clutched his chest in pain. The police was not gentle with him or Jane, although Jeff was practically immune to pain, trying to run after being bucked in the chest by a fully trained and muscled officer. It's gonna leave an ebony in pain. I need to hide for a bit. Jeff observed his surroundings. The woods were quiet, too quiet for comfort. Not here. Bet that one faceless thing is out here anyway. Jeff got on his hoofs, reaching into a saddlebag he had with him. Inside was his infamous white hoodie, his knife, and also a few things such as a water bottle, rags, bandages, and a cutie mark alternation kit. Your time to shine once more, my friend. Jeff's giant evil smile once again shined across his pure white face. A red glow surrounded the worn brown leather case, lifting it out of its place in the back, and onto a tree stump, where it was placed with ever so much care. If one is to hide, one is to look like they have nothing to hide. Hee hee ha ha. A cutie mark altercation kit is an illegal assembly of spell and tools of alternation, used for the very purpose of making a cutie mark appear different from what it truly is. Most criminals are given away by their cutie marks. The first one was assembled in 1888 London by the king of serial killers, Jack the Ripper. It was purposely left behind as a bitch slap to the London detectives, to show they could never be able to identify him now. This was soon adopted by criminals worldwide, making authorities have to develop methods to defy these. This only dragged the endless war on crime out, and onto a whole new grand stage. Magic cannot make a cutie mark appear, but it can mask it once it has appeared to begin with. This is done by making a pre-made casting of a cutie mark, then using ink to make the cutie mark look. It is then put onto a clear sheet of paper. The paper is delicately covered in an alteration potion to infuse the two together permanently, then applied to the flank, in which it alters the actual cutie mark to look like just another part of fur. The fake then looks like a legitimate cutie mark. Some criminal masterminds have even found out ways to fight the typical countermeasures to this act of deception. Jeff has obviously used this before, but he has expanded his kit a bit more with colored contacts and a variety of other small details to hide his most notable features. First thing was first, his cutie mark, which was a knife with a splatter of blood behind it. He had been saving this simple yet believable persona, a pre-made casting of a big smile, simple, easy to remember, and a gentle persona to go with it. Perfect. All he used was black ink to make an outline. His coat would provide the color. The next part was a pain in the ass, but was required, or he would be given away too easily. Jeff's ominous smile was his most notable feature. Anybody who knows who he is will be able to identify him. Jeff, in response, invented a little something of his own, an alteration spell for white bandaging applied to the sides of his face to hide the cuts. Last, 2 sky blue color contacts to cover his coal black eyes. With it, Jeff looked as normal as ever. Although mentally insane, the crafty bastard has managed to perfect hiding his psychotic self when need be. This time being one of those occasions. He put everything back into the case in a slow carrying process, so as to not damage anything, returning it to his saddlebag, which was put on his back. Jeff then began to walk towards the empty trail, which was only a good 15-minute walk away. Upon reaching the trail, which at this very location was upon the crest of a hill overlooking Manhattan, Jeff gave a very marking wave to the glistening city, which will be soon informed that its serial killer has been chased away for the time being. Walking away, he looked all around, noticing that given all the chaos prior, it was a clam night. Jeff considered to observe the nature around him for about an hour. 'Twas abnormal of him to do something like this. What broke his state of mind was a small village. It was far enough away from the city to keep the big game authorities out of his mane, and from the looks of it, not a police department in sight. This may sound unbelievable, but it's notoriously common to towns that are spared the commotion of large-scale cities. A sign just a few feet to his left said, "Ponneville 4 miles ahead." It was official. Jeff was to hide here in the town of Ponneville. Chapter 2. Walking around. The town of Ponneville was quiet, and not a pony in sight. Although he had yet to enter the actual town itself, he wandered around the suburban area looking for a cheap inn to take refuge in for the night being. Passing a tree cottage, Jeff walked over a bridge, and the first thing he found was an inn. Thankfully, this would be his home for the time being. Walking inside, he looked around and saw an opening at the front desk, just a bell and a little sign that said "Ring for service." Jeff tapped his hoof against the bell. A moment later, a mint green pony with a cyan mane, white streaks in her mane and beautiful sunglow eyes walked out. "Hi, my name is Lyra. How can I help you?" she said. Hi." Jeff's voice sounded dry. He needed something to drink. "You need a room?" She smiled. Yeah, actually. Do you have the time, by the way?" Lyra looked to a clock on the wall mounted above the door. "It's 5:57 a.m. Kinda late to get a room, don't you think?" She giggled to herself. "I suppose it is." He scratched the back of his head. "Well, can I get a room?" Lyra nodded and smiled once more. "Of course, just sign the registry and pay a 3-bit fee." She scooted forward the registry, an inkwell and a quill. A red glow surrounded the quill, dipping it into the inkwell, and signing the name Bright Smiles onto the lines. Lyra looked at the name sign before her. "Bright Smiles, huh? Nice to meet you. I told you my name already. Let me be the first to welcome you to Ponneville." "Thanks." Jeff pulled out 3 bits and put them onto the counter. "You look like you don't normally work here." Jeff obviously has a knack for observing. "You're right, Hannah. I actually play liar, but it hasn't been enough to pay this month's rent, so I got another job." She placed a key on the counter and slid it towards Jeff. "It pays well, and I need the money, so." "Oh, sorry to hear that. I went through, ma'am." He picked up the key. "Room 6E down the hall on your left." She pointed down the hall with a smile. "Was pretty awake for 6 o'clock in the morning, if you asked me." "Thank you, Lyra." Jeff gave a half-assed smile and proceeded down the hall to the left as Lyra said, 4E, 5E, 6E, here we are." He put the key into the lock and opened the door. It's just a simple 1-bed-in room. A single nightstand and a lamp on top, a coffee table with 2 chairs. Walking inside and shutting the door, Jeff threw his saddlebag onto the bed. He doesn't sleep, but now he could plan his next move. Opening the pouch opposite of the one that contained his precious case was an assortment of maps. Each one was different. One was strictly for road systems, another was a regular map, the last being a map of police jurisdictions. Scanning the map, he located Ponneville, and noticed it was within nobody's jurisdiction. All he has to worry about is the Canterlot Royal Guard, who is in town to protect a Princess Twilight Sparkle. He needed to know the layout of this place. What better way than to go walk around town? It was morning anyhow, so Jeff decided it was time for a little scouting. Exiting his room, he walked once more to the front desk. Lyra was reading an old book of sorts. "Leaving so soon?" she said in a curious tone. "Just gonna go look around town, get a feel for the place." "Recommend any places?" "Yeah, you should check out Supercube Corner. It's a great place." Lyra was extremely enthusiastic and friendly. Jeff's curiosity was piqued by the book. "Can I ask what you're reading?" He cocked his head to the right slightly. "It's a book about the slender pony, if you are into that stuff." She looked down at the desk, clearly embarrassed. "Most ponies think I'm crazy, especially my roommate Bon Bon." Jeff could only chuckle and shake his head. You don't know crazy, and besides he's real. I know, I've seen him. Really? Lyra looked amazed, but doesn't he take every penny he sees? He can't see, if he doesn't have any eyes. Besides we just looked at each other for a bit then walked our separate ways. Anyway, I'll tell you about it later. I'm gonna go around town for a bit. Jeff waved and walked out the door, leaving Lyra in a world of wonder. What Jeff said is true. His encounter with the slender pony was truly one of the oddest experiences of his life, but that's a story for another time. The sun had begun to rise. Some ponies began to walk out onto the streets. One pony in particular caught Jeff's eye, a pink pony with a large curly pink mane who hopped around like she was on a sugar rush. What she said left him even more perplexed. My pinky senses tell me there's a new pony in town. Pinky sense, this bitch is gonna figure me out. Jeff covered his mouth, realizing he said that out loud. Thankfully Nopany heard him. New priority, avoid this mare at all costs. This pinky sense will expose him. Sneaking behind a few buildings, Jeff managed to move on by the pink mare. He continued on. The town for the most part looked like an average run-of-the-mill kind of place, simple, small and away from the city. As Jeff took in the sights all around him, he didn't notice that the pink pony he was trying to avoid was right in front of him. Hi. Hagwa. Jeff was startled when he had to take on a persona, completely different pony than the one we all know. Are you new here? I've never seen you around here before. Pinky looked at Jeff from all angles, grabbing his legs, his horn and other various parts before finally stopping. I'm just He cleared his throat. Down for a bit. I'm Pinkie Pie. What's your name? She turned her head upside down while leaning forward. Bright Smiles. My name is Bright Smiles. Are you hiding something? I feel like you're hiding something from me. A face suggesting she was thinking washed over her face. This made Jeff weary. I know you startled me is all. Look, I don't mean to be rude, Pinkie Pie, but I'd really like to look around town. I don't have time for conversation right now. Okie dokie Loki. Pinkie Pie hopped away, and said to herself, he's hiding something from me. Huck. Jeff let out an annoyed sigh. I swear I'm gonna stab her in the throat. He walked away annoyed. As he walked away, a feeling in the back of his head began to slowly arise, craving to punch something. Jeff could only hold back for so long before he snapped, and it was coming. Chapter 3 Attack. Jeff had explored as much of Ponyville as he possibly could, but it was becoming difficult to keep his persona in check. The urge was building up, and Jeff had already began to go through the process of reverting to his normal self. He was starting to giggle quietly to himself for absolutely no reason. He was also beginning to shake. His contacts had fallen out due to his spell can't suffice for his missing eyelids. The bandaging which was placed on the sides of his face, to cover the cuts that elongated his smile, were not able to hold much longer. Normally he'd rush out of sight to fix this, but Jeff's irrational state of mind simply did not care. He liked his smile. It made him beautiful. Jeff had forgotten to cover the black burn marks that surrounded his eyes, but thankfully it just looked like smeared mascara. His cutie mark was thankfully unaffected. The alteration spell would keep it that way for a few days. As Jeff passed a trash can, he tore the bandaging right off his face, revealing that large, sadistic smile he hid underneath. With it, just like the pony Pinkie Pie, who he had met earlier, Jeff began to hop all around instead of walk. He did this with a laugh of joy. Immediately, Jeff drew attention to himself. Most ponies just rolled their eyes and said silently below their breath, "Oh great, just what we need, another Pinkie Pie." Others stopped dead in their tracks, taking note of his oddly large smile and extremely wide eyes. He had changed course and headed back for the inn, hopping around like an excited little colt would. As he began to make his way through the market, he suddenly stopped and stared at a pony who had caught his eye. A yellow mare, cutie marked, consisting of 3 butterflies. She had a long pink mane and tail. She slowly looked at him, and seemed to freeze with fear at the sight of the white stallion who was staring at her. Jeff didn't break the line of sight. He continued to watch her even as she seemed to speed walk away. Jeff ran towards the inn he was staying at, walking inside and into his room as fast as he could. Jeff reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his hoodie. before putting it on, its gentle silk filling surrounding him. Jeff pulled out the knife he used on all his victims, holding it sideways by the handle. He saw a window which would be perfect to sneak out of, and not draw attention, and so that's what he did. Opening the window, hopping outside and running to the backwoods of Ponyville, Jeff quickly caught up to the mare, who had caught his eye. Remaining out of sight, to not get him caught, he followed her all the way up to her cottage. Jeff could only let out a slight giggle. The urge had taken over. Jeff was going to kill once more. He began to sneak up to the cottage, looking in the window, noticing this place was full of animals which may or may not be a problem. The mare tended to all these animals, probably her pets, no doubt. Jeff continued to observe, trying to see if there was a stallion of the house he'd had to off as well, but he saw none. The mare walked upstairs out of sight. Time to make his move. Jeff climbed onto the cottage. It was easy considering the fact it's built into a tree. He pulled onto the leaves, pulling himself up to the window above. The mare was brushing her mane. He stared at her with the most evil smile. She suddenly stopped. She could see him in the reflection of the mirror. She slowly turned around with the most horrified look. Jeff cocked his right foreleg back, throwing it forward with all his might, shattering the window. Jeff lunged towards her. All she could do was scream as loud as her lung capacity would permit. He rammed her into the dresser to silence her screaming, grabbing her by the head, and slamming her face into the mirror. Shards of glass cut into her face like a storm of razor blades, to which afterwards he threw her to the ground. She cried and begged for mercy. Jeff only laughed manically, before grabbing his knife. He leaned forward, and covered the mare's mouth, and said in a gentle voice, "Hush, you seem tired, go to sleep." He raised his knife, ready to drive it into her. "Hey, what the fuck do you think you're doing?" a voice cried out. Jeff looked up to see a blue Pegasus with rainbow mane standing in the window frame. She suddenly charged at him. Jeff dodged her, and swung his knife. Blood followed in a thin trail that stained the wooden floor. The mare grabbed her cheek. The knife had sliced right through. Jeff only laughed at this. He laughed, and laughed, and laughed. Just before he could do anything else, he looked out the window, to see a group of ponies running towards the house. That mare's scream must have alerted them. Jeff could only grab the mare, and look into her eyes. "I'll be back for you, he ha 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 ha." He threw her to the ground, leaped out the window, vanishing as quickly as he appeared, leaving the two mares to bleed on the floor. The ponies burst through the front door. They ran upstairs to see their friends in a puddle of blood. Pinkie Pie, who was among them, was the first to speak. "Dashy, Fluttershy, what happened?" "He tried to kill me." His smile, his evil smile. Fluttershy said as she gripped her blood-covered face. "Who tried to kill you?" A white unicorn mare said, the mare known as Rarity. Some fucking nutcase with a ridiculous smile. Rainbow said as she stood up holding her bloody cheek. "That sounds familiar. Where in darnation have I heard of that?" Applejack scratched her head. It wouldn't be too long now. They would soon know that Jeff the Killer was loose in Ponyville. Chapter 4. Blame it on someone else. The quiet town Ponyville was now erupting with commotion as a group of doctors and nurses ran towards Fluttershy's cottage, called at Princess Twilight's order. They brought in tow 2 medical carts to bring the victims to the hospital for immediate medical attention. Most medical emergencies were never this severe. It was something unusual. Out of the way. "Medical emergency, please clear the streets," one of the doctors shouted. Ponies stared in surprise. When they arrived at the cottage, the sight was all simply too horrifying. 2 mares laying on the floor with blood all around. If it wasn't for Princess Twilight's magic, they would have bled to death by now. Without hesitation, the medical professionals began to assess the situation. They concluded that Rainbow Dash would require stitching, and that Fluttershy will require immediate surgery to remove the shards of glass from her face. They loaded Dash and Shy into the medical carts and rushed them to the hospital, wasting no time. As they ran through the town, everybody who saw the 2 mares could only look on in absolute disbelief. Who would want to hurt Fluttershy? Rainbow Dash made a little more sense considering she tended to be extremely rude at times. They were rushed into the ICU at once, leaving their friends to contemplate all of this. Twilight dear, who in the name of Celestia would want to hurt Fluttershy? Rarity said as her bottom lip quivered. She clenched her eyes shut, trying not to tear up. I don't know, Rarity. Whoever did this will be brought to justice. I will see to that. I can't believe this is happening. This has never happened before. Applejack lightly shook her head. Whoever did this is a real meanie. Pinkie Pie crossed her forelegs in anger. I'm going to have Spike send a letter to the princess informing her of this attack, and I will be requesting that the royal guard be sent here at once. Twilight said as she paced back and forth in the living room of Fluttershy's cottage. That would be best. With this psycho running around, we cannot take any risks. Rarity added in. Fluttershy said that this pony had an evil smile. Now I know I've heard that somewhere before. Where did I hear that? Applejack stomped her hoof. Frustrated, she could not remember where she had heard of somebody with an evil smile. You'll look into it, Applejack. It does ring a bell. I believe I saw a story in the paper about a pony who fit that description. We'll have to figure this out later though, girls. We should get to the hospital and see how Rainbow and Shy are doing. I agree completely, Rarity said as she headed for the door, the others following not far behind. As they headed into town, all of them were bombarded with questions by everybody on the street. Many were in a state of panic and fright. This has never happened in Ponyville history. They all answered as best as they could, but ponies cluttered the streets, which made it difficult to even continue on to the hospital. Of course, the girls couldn't be too mad at everybody for being frightened. A psycho was on the loose. Eventually they got a break, and managed to free themselves of the crowd, continuing onwards only to be approached here and there by somebody who was curious. One pony approached them, looking around all confused. It was the new stallion in town. Bright Smiles was his name. What's all the commotion? Did I miss something? He asked, looking extremely confused. Jeff was a fantastic actor. Somebody attacked our friends, Applejack said in an aggravated voice. Oh, how awful. Yeah. Pinkie Pie got extremely close to him. You wouldn't happen to know of somebody who may have committed this crime, would you? Her eyes seemed to literally pop out of her head. No. Of course not. I would never speak to such a lowlife. Do they know who did it? He leaned forward curiously. All we know is that it was a white pony who had evil smiling coal-black eyes, Twilight said in response. Well, that sounds like Jane the Killer to me. This was too good an opportunity to pass up. Jane the who? Applejack looked baffled. Jane the Killer, she's homicidal murderer on the run. I actually was hoping that this place would be a little safer than Manhattan given the events prior, but I guess she must have been chased out of the city and found her way here. Well then, we may have our culprit. How do you know it's her though? Rarity looked at Jeff, or Bright Smiles if you prefer. Well, considering that Manhattan isn't too far from here, and that she has been on a killing spree there, it may be possible she moved on to here. You better be careful, she's ruthless. Come on girls, we've got a murderer to bring to justice, Twilight said as she walked away, heading towards the library, to inform the princess that Jane the Killer was responsible for this. As they walked away, Jeff smiled to himself. Not only were there no suspicions on him, but now he was off the hook scot-free. If Jane's murders weren't enough to get her caught, attacking a friend close to a princess may be just the thing. He chuckled lightly, and walked away towards Sugar Cube Corner. It's funny, Jeff's little brother's philosophy was, if you don't want to get caught, blame it on someone else. Chapter 5 Terror in Ponyville. Newspaper article. Terror in Ponyville. Yesterday morning at around 8:45 a.m., a mayor was viciously assaulted by wanted homicidal murderer, Jane the Killer. Although this has yet to be 100% confirmed, description of a white pony with coal-black eyes and an evil smile. This seems to fit her description. Local animal caretaker, Fluttershy, was one of the victims of this unprovoked attack. Wee Thermer, Rainbow Dash, winner of the Cloudsdale flight competition for her Sonic Rainboom, was also attacked when she attempted to defend her friend. The two are currently hospitalized, but are expected to make a full recovery. Bounty. Princess Twilight Sparkle has put up a large bounty of 300 bits to whoever can bring Jane the Killer to justice. This is suspected to put an even larger strain on the already substantial amount of coin that weighs over her head. Jane was last spotted with Jeff the Killer in Manhattan, but is suspected to be hiding in somewhere outside of Ponyville. Slenderman sighted again. The odd paranormal/extraterrestrial entente known as the Slender Man was sighted once more in the Sweet Apple Acres orchard. 3 young fillies were out at play when they found what appeared to be a note on a tree. The note was taken by a group of personnel who refused to identify what branch of government they served. Only a logo was seen to identify them. See picture below. The Slender Man supposedly arrived shortly after, and the 3 fillies supposedly ran away in panic only to followed. A playbacker, Applejack, was quoted in saying them little young'uns came running out of that orchard faster than a timber wolf running from a fire. Another farm worker by the name of Big Macintosh was quoted in saying yep, no investigation is to be conducted. Chapter 6 Jane the Killer. The bustling streets of Manhattan were always alive, and well with activity. Ponies of every single variety could be found here. Poor, rich, rustic, fancy, you name it. You could also find just about any wanted criminal attempting to take cover from the law here. One in particular would be Jane the Killer. She managed to escape the MMPD the night of the raid. She's still pissed off about it too. She had her chance to take down Jeff and put his crap to an end, but they came in and ruined the whole freaking thing. It had only been 2 days since, so the police were still looking for her, but she had her ways of hiding. Jane wore a rather fancy sun hat, simple and yet effective. It had a veil that fell down onto it, that helped hide her eyes. If anybody saw them, she'd be busted. It wasn't uncommon to see a mayor wearing a sun hat here in the big city anyhow. They were used more as a fashion statement, and not as an actual sun hat. Of course, just like Jeff, she had used a cutie mark alteration kit. Practically every criminal has one. So she walked around the city, head low and calmly as to not draw suspicions to herself. She wouldn't be caught, as long as she kept this up. Jane continued her little stroll up Norther Boulevard, until a newspaper advertiser caught her attention. Extra. Read all about it. Jane the Killer strikes in Ponyville. This totally threw her for a curveball. It made no sense. She was here in Manhattan, not in Ponyville. Hey buddy, you'll take one of those? She handed him 2 bits. He handed her a newspaper, picked up another one, and began to advertise once more. Jane walked a few feet away, then began to read the article to herself. Terror in Ponyville. Yesterday morning at around 8:45 a.m. a mayor was assaulted by wanted homicidal murderer Jane the Killer. Jane was extremely pissed off, and she had reason to be. She didn't do this. This is such bullshit. That little motherfucker thinks he can pin this on me. She threw the paper onto the ground in frustration and stomped away, leaving a few pedestrians baffled at her little outburst. Jane walked down the sidewalk, talking to herself, and having random loud outbursts. That son of a bitch thinks he can blame this on me. Bullshit. I'm going to find him, and cut his fucking throat, and put his shit to an end. Excuse me, miss. An officer who she had just passed up said, looking at his partner who was just as confused. She stopped and turned around, but did not look up. You mind watching your language? Also, who can pin what on you? He stepped forward. None of your damn business, pig. Jane spit in his direction then turned around to walk off. Hey. The officer reached for her, grabbing her saddlebag and incidentally pulling it off, which also yanked her fake cutie mark right off, exposing the actual one. Wait a minute, it's Jane the Killer. Whoops up dirtbag. His partner shouted, aiming his horn directly at her. Fuck off. Jane threw her back leg into the officer, who had yanked off her saddlebag. The sound of his jawbone cracking echoed. Jane grabbed her back and ran off. Just as the other officer began firing stun spells at her, she managed to avoid them. Running into an alleyway, she took cover behind a dumpster. The officer passed her, to which she ran out of the alley and back onto the streets. She was only greeted by more officers who were now ready to use lethal force. She ran into another alley, which thankfully was a straight shot to the Manhattan suburbs. If she can get there, she would have no trouble escaping. Jane threw her saddlebag back onto her back and prepared to jump a fence that was the only thing blocking her way at freedom. She picked up speed, lowered herself and jumped clear over the fence. The MMPD would now have to suck up the fact that they just let 2 of Equestria's biggest serial killers escape. Jane was not free just yet though. She had to get through the suburbs and out of their jurisdiction before she could throw a party. The suburbs were quiet and normally had no police whatsoever, but that was soon to change. They would not let her get away. Jane, however, would not let them catch her. She'd rather die than be a prisoner. She ran through some backyards. The sounds of the police and canine units could be heard in pursuit. When I find that piece of shit, he is dead. She hopped a wooden fence and continued to run. She went this way, Mon. She turned around as she heard the officers burst through a fence gate. Jane exited the last backyard and began running on the main road out of Manhattan. She was basically free. The police would never be able to catch her now. She took a left into the wooded area, to catch her breath more precisely. When I get my hoops on him, I'm gonna pummel his brains out. She wiped away a few drops of sweat on her forehead. Letting out an annoyed sigh, she walked back out onto the path, walking away from Manhattan, angry, sweaty, and tired. Jane had only one thing in mind: find Jeff. Find him and kill him. That was always the plan anyway, but now she was even more angry with him, if that was even possible. Jane continued to walk. She walked for what seemed like hours, before reaching the same place Jeff had overlooked Ponyville a few days ago. I found you, you son of a bitch. Chapter 7 Fight. The sun had just reached the center of the sky as it was at its peak of noon. A peaceful day, yet everybody couldn't get Jane out of their minds. Over the past 2 days, she had attempted to kill Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash more than 3 times, or so they thought anyhow. Jeff got a kick out of the thought that he was not even a suspect in this matter. Today he was bright smiles though. He had taken well to this persona in the past 3 days he had been in Ponyville, managing to repress his urges by simply killing some animals instead of ponies, but he was still bent on killing the 2 mares he had hospitalized 2 days ago. For now though, he'd simply enjoy his time here in Ponyville. He had taken a liking to Sugar Cube Corner's milkshakes. Jeff was on his way there to get one now. Actually, he was in a rather good mood. Granted, he was always happy, but this is the first time he had felt normal in a long time. He knew, however, this wouldn't last. His destroyed psyche wouldn't permit it. Jeff would just have to tough it out, as long as he could, before he blew his cover, and had to bail on this place. When he arrived at Sugar Cube Corner, he noticed the place was packed. Busy day. One table caught his eye. The table was occupied by Princess Twilight and friends. He figured he might see if they still thought Jane was the one who had committed the crime. Jeff approached the table. The girls greeted him in a friendly manner. They seemed to be doing a bit better. "Hello all," he said, standing next to the table. "Hi." Bright smiles. Pinkie Pie was more excited than he was used to seeing. "Oh, hello." Bright smiles. "Lovely to see you again," Rarity said with a smile on her face. Bright smiles. "Just the pony I wanted to see actually." Twilight had a stack of newspapers before her. "What are those?" He pointed to the newspapers. "Old newspapers. I wanted to do as much research as I could on Jane, but it seems like she only is around when someone named Jeff the Killer has already made a strike. That's who I've been trying to remember," Applejack said with a grin, happy to finally remember. "Jeff the Killer?" he said in a baffled tone. "Yes, apparently he's one of Equestria's biggest serial killers, and he may be here in Ponyville. Well, let's hope for the best." Jeff looked away from them. Suddenly, a pony burst through the door. A pony with dark blackened eyes. Jane the Killer was here. She held in her mouth Jeff's saddlebag. She must have went to his room and stolen it. "You mother fucker," she said in a muffled voice. Everybody stood in horror. She was here, right in front of them. She walked towards Bright Smiles, and dropped the saddlebag. Everybody could see something was clearly about to go down, but what exactly? Bright Smiles seemed very nice. Why would Jane have a bone to pick with him? "Pardon?" Jeff responded nervously. He really was nervous too. Jane knew how to piss him off. "Quit bullshitting me." She stepped forward, pointing a hoof directly at him. "I know exactly what kind of game you're playing, and I'm not buying it. You may have these saps fooled, but you can't fool me." Twilight stood up. "Jane the Killer." Jane turned to Twilight, with the most angered look. "By order of the Royal Equestrian Government, I hereby place you under arrest." "Ha! Whatever, princess, stay out of this. You'll live longer." She turned back to Jeff. "Look, I don't know who you are, or what you want, but you have the wrong pony. Jeff said defensively. Oh. She lifted up his saddlebag. Everyone knows what this is, right? Bright smile. Saddlebag. Well then explain this. She threw the contents of the saddlebag onto the floor, Brittany gasping at the sight of the blood-stained white hoodie and large blood-covered knife. You dare try to accuse me of being some psycho? Jeff took a step forward. If you aren't him, then put the hoodie on. Prove me wrong. She grinned, knowing she had him cornered. Fine, I'll humor you. He put on the blood-stained hoodie, but it didn't look like a match to Jeff at all. Stop this right now, Rarity declared in defiance. Bright smiles is a good pony, unlike a low-life murderer such as yourself. Jane ignored this comment. She looked at Jeff, trying to think of how she is going to get him to snap. She had to. If he didn't, she wouldn't get her chance to put him to an end. Your mother didn't think you were beautiful, and she hated your smile. She grinned deviously. What did you say? Jeff took a step back. That hit really close to home. A burning sensation irritated from the back of his head. Mommy lied to you. Daddy lied to you. They all lied to you. Everybody except Jane and Jeff looked confused. Jeff was beginning to lose control of himself. Stop, he said. Your smile is the ugliest thing I have ever seen next to your disfigured face. Jane laughed at her insult. Enough, Rarity shouted. She stood up and walked towards Jane with no regards to her own safety. I don't know who you think you are, coming in here and insulting him like that, but you are done, you hear me? Now get out of here, before I use my hoof to force you out. Who the fuck do you think you are? Jane stood over Rarity, looking down on her. Jane suddenly found herself on the ground, the side of her face in pain. She looked up to find Jeff standing on his hind legs, left foreleg extended and himself breathing heavily. One of his bandages had begun to peel off, his contacts had been torn out. She had done it. Jane had managed to bring out Jeff the killer. Finally, I got you, you motherfucker. Jane lunged towards Jeff, only to be grabbed and slammed against the ground. He began to lay a volley of punches down upon her. Jane punched Jeff's left cheek, tearing the bandaging right off, revealing his elongated permanent smile that was hidden beneath it. She kicked his hind leg, tearing his fake cutie mark right off. Jeff grabbed her once more, picking her up, and throwing Jane right out of the window, and onto the street, turning around and picking up his knife, before hopping through the broken window. Laughing manically, Jane drew her knife. She was going to let him have it. Jane got to her hoops, and charged at Jeff. She tackled him to the ground, almost too easily though. As she raised her knife up to stab him, Jeff swung his right at her foreleg, slicing deep into her. He then slashed her left cheek, before punching her in the eye, and knocking her to the ground. Jane's mind was rushing with thoughts. She had underestimated Jeff. She expected this to be easy, but he was a lot tougher than she ever could have imagined, and he was a lot more ruthless. Jane suddenly felt a burning feeling in her leg. She screamed in pain. Jeff only laughed as he twisted the knife around, pushing it deeper behind Jane's right kneecap. Using her left leg, she kicked Jeff back, yanked the knife out, and threw it aside. She stood over a disarmed Jeff, knife raised high. She threw her foreleg down with all her might, driving the knife towards him. Jeff put both of his front hoops on the ground, and launched himself forward, kicking Jane directly in her lower jaw. Her jaw was shoved to the side with such force, the sound of muscle tendons ripping could be heard, along with the sound of breaking bone. Jane fell to the ground, clutching her jaw in pain. Jeff grabbed his knife, shoved her forelegs aside, and sent the knife directly into Jane's throat. He pulled it back out and stabbed again, severing her jugular, and coating himself in her blood. He stood above her, listening to her dying gargled breaths, and laughing ever so joyfully at this. Finally, Jane slipped away, and died in a pool of blood. Jeff looked up at the crowd surrounding him. He tore off the other bandage, then ran inside Sugar Cube Corner, grabbing his saddlebag and running off. A ground of ponies attempted to pursue him, but stopped shortly after. Jeff was not going to remain in Ponyville, and they knew this anyway. The crowd slowly approached Jane's lifeless body. They looked at her in absolute shock and horror. This was simply the most gory day in Ponyville history. It would also be marked as the day Jane the Killer was killed by Jeff the Killer. Chapter 8. 2 weeks later. It had been 2 weeks since the brutal duel to the death between Jeff and Jane. No murders, no sightings, no nothing of Jeff, vanished without a trace. News of this event had reached every corner of Equestria, and seemed to be all the buzz in the capital city of Canterlot. It was all the Canterlotians wished to speak of. It's not every day two major serial killers fight to the death. Many ponies had been expecting it, and it had even started debates over which one was better. They somehow managed to find a more positive side to this gory end to a pony's life. Many had theorized that Jeff had ran off into the woods outside of Ponyville. Others believed that he was hiding right under their snouts in Canterlot. Hard to believe though, the security in the city is second to none. Most wanted criminals who venture into this glorious place in disguise get busted right away due to the Royal Guard is equipped with the best crime-fighting tools in the world. This topic had even caught Princess Celestia's attention. She believed that he was hiding somewhere in Canterlot, and taken extra precautions to avoid any unwanted events to erupt in her fair city. So much so she had ordered 40 more guards to be recruited. Princess Celestia and her sister Luna were in the throne room having a chat about this matter. "Sister, I do believe you are overreacting. There is nothing to fear. You are an all-powerful being. He is just some lowlife," Luna said. She gently shook her head. Retaining a smile though, she found it silly that one pony would scare her big sister. "Regardless, Luna, my subjects are at risk. I do not wish for blood to be on my hoofs." Celestia's heart was definitely in the right place. She didn't want any more of her subjects to be harmed. "I doubt he will be showing his face again anytime sooner, sister, but if you wish to take these measures, I shan't object." Luna looked out the window. 'Twas her time to shine, for the moon beckoned to be raised. "Perhaps you should think this over a good night's rest." Celestia lightly giggled. "Perhaps I should." She stepped down from the throne, passing by her sister. "Good night, Luna," she said as she exited the throne room, heading down the hallway in which 2 guards walked by her sides. Escort was normal for her, and with all the security she had added, this was required. They followed her to her quarters, then stopped and stood at post in front of the door. She walked inside a room, taking in the beautiful night light that glistened through her window. Her horn glowed to turn on a lamp as she prepared for a night's slumber, removing her crown and setting it on a nightstand right next to her bed. She then turned the lamp off, pulled back the covers, and climbed into bed. Celestia made herself comfy, tucking herself in, if you would, and closed her eyes, and drifted away to sleep. Something was on her bed, she could feel it. Celestia opened her eyes. Her vision was distorted and blurry. She noticed right away her bedroom door, that led to the outside balcony, was open. The wind blew into the room, letting in the cold air from the outside. As her vision began to come to, she began to make out the features on this pony. Suddenly she noticed his cold black eyes and big, sadistic smile, his white hoodie, and what looked like a trace of blood on his upper lip, that followed the seams of his smile. Her widened. She opened her mouth to scream for the guard, but suddenly felt a hoof shoving against it. He held her down with unbelievable strength. Her screams were muffled, but she continued as loudly as she could in her panic. He leaned forward, staring directly into her eyes. A knife came into view, surrounded by a red glow. Pressing his forehead against hers, he whispered ever so gently, "Hush, princess, just go to sleep."
That's all, Zipsters! Like and subscribe.